The wind had a way of finding skin, no matter how carefully a man hid behind wool and leather and black. It slid under collars and between the boards of shutters. It nosed at gaps in the stones like a cold and curious animal, and when it rose from the haunted forest it came salted with the resin of pine and the iron of old snow. Jon Snow listened to it as he walked the top of the wall, his boots crunching frost, Ghost drifting along the parapet with a soundless grace that made the direwolf seem a wisp of fog more than flesh. Dawn had not yet admitted itself. The east was a pallor of bone where sky should be. The sun was a rumor. Jon's breath smoked before him and disappeared into that rumor. Below him the world was an expanse of white and tree dark. The forest a black suture sewn across the distance from edge to edge, pulled tight by winter's hand. Somewhere beyond that line lay Mance Rayder with his camps and cookfires and songs, with his giants in cold-cracked mail and his tents stitched from 1,000 rags of 1,000 years, with his dead men and his women not yet dead, with his child unborn quickening inside Dalla's belly. Jon could not see the camps from here, but he felt their presence like a heavy thought. When the wind turned, it carried the faintest ash-sweet hint of their life. It smelled like other people's bread. After a time, he realized he had stopped walking. His gloved hand rested on the ice, palm down, as if feeling for a pulse. The wall did not pulse. It groaned like a glacier deep in its sleep. His fingertips burned cold. He took them away and flexed them open and closed, and the leather creaked. "Ghost," he said without looking. The dire wolf lifted his head. Snow powdered the beast's muzzle and whiskers, a white that matched the white of his fur so completely Jon could not at first see what belonged to the world and what belonged to the animal. The eyes were blood and ember. "We'll go down," Jon told him. The words were for himself. He did not like turning his back on the forest when the forest held so many songs. He climbed down the inner stairs with care, one hand on the cold rope, boots on the rungs, the great blue world opening over his shoulder for a time and then narrowing to the darkness of the shaft. At the base, the wall was a cliff of frozen memory. Men in black drifted to and fro with lanterns cupped to their chests. They looked thinner each day, and even the young moved like old men after a hard winter. Maester Aemon's ravens muttered from the rookery high above like a scribe's dust-dry voice reading out a line of names that none wished to hear. He found Sam in the old armory where they'd stacked arrows in sheaves and piled bowstrings in bowls. Sam's hands had cracked in a lattice at the knuckles, and he had taken to rubbing them with tallow. He looked up when Jon entered and made a small sound that could have been greeting or worry. Sam's greetings were often worried. "You're early," Sam said, though it was not a question. "Or late. I lost the hour." "Both," Jon said and managed to smile. "You should try sleeping when your eyes close." "Ido. It's just that they open right away again." Sam looked past Jon toward the doorway, toward the night that stood on the threshold like an uninvited guest. "Is it true he lit 900 fires last night? If you count the ones they light to keep the bears away from the meat and the meat away from the men," Jon said. It was a lot. The truth was he had not counted. He had stood on the wall as darkness pooled into the forest and watched the lights come up like sparks caught in a giant's breath, and he had tried to remember each for the space of a simple breath and had failed. There were more fires than thoughts. Sam licked his lower lip, chapped and blood-pricked. He looked as if he wanted to say something that would take a while to say. When Sam's thoughts had to travel a long road to come to his tongue, he stared at his fingers as if he'd hidden the words there. "I had a dream," he said at last. "Well, not a dream. It was a dream, because I was asleep, but I mean..." He flushed and shook his head, sending a drift of dandruff from his hair. "The ravens were loud, and then there was quiet and I was walking in it. The quiet, it wasn't empty. It was like a room where everybody is holding their breath. I heard... there was a voice telling a story. I think it was telling it to me. I remember the words light in a king's blood, and I don't want to remember more than that." Jon had no words for that, and so he gripped Sam's shoulder in a way that made the lantern flame flicker on the wall. Physical affection was a kind of conversation he had learned when talk would not serve. They ate in the common hall with wooden spoons and thin stew that steamed more than it fed. Janos Slint took his trencher and his complaints at the high table, as if he had been born to a lord's place instead of to the ledger-lined shadow of King's Landing's alleys. He had a talent for being heard. The air already carried so much sound, coughs, spoons, the drag of boots, that Slint's voice worked its way through with the keenness of a small knife. "Your steward," he said, without turning his head, the word tossed down the table where Jon could hear it plainly enough. "Will learn to keep better hours, or I'll find him something to keep him up nights. Chamber pots require attention at the strangest times." Jon found his stew again and watched the thin, pale surface settle. If he spoke, Slint would have the pleasure of hearing it. Pleasure was in short supply, and Jon did not care to provide it to Janos Slint. After, when the lanterns had been trimmed and the men sent to their posts, he climbed to the Lord Commander's solar. There would be no Lord Commander until the votes could be taken, and the votes would not be taken while the wildling host pressed the wall, and the wildling host would press the wall until something happened that had not yet happened. For now the room belonged to nobody and to him because he had work and nobody else thought to do it. He laid out the maps with their torn edges and old ink and newer stains, and he traced with his finger the line of the forest and the little drawings for the hills where giants loved to sing and the swales where dead leaves were gathered under snow like letters never read. He could hear the wind outside the shutter, a thrum deep as a drum buried in earth. A knock sounded on the doorframe and he straightened. The first man through the threshold was thin as a pole and wrapped in a cloak of patched sealskin that smelled of oil and fish and a little of the sea. The second man wore his beard like a personal oath and his eyes like a private winter. The first was Cotter Pike, who had come from Eastwatch with a riding of his hard men to say a thing he had already said and would say again because it did not stop being true. Eastwatch could not keep its own when the sea froze around the pilings and the wind came off the water with teeth. The second man was Bowen Marsh, who had grown into a frost, and his lace of white in his beard had a sour sorrow in it. "There's a ship," Cotter said without greeting. "3 if I count the long shadow and the false wake. And a banner, though it's not a banner I know." Jon felt something move in him, the thought that had stumbled awake on the wall earlier. "From the east. From the place ships come from," Cotter said, "which could be east, west, or the belly of a whale. I sent men to the 40 Fathom, and they came back with stories of black sails and a red woman looking into a brazier like she lost something in it." Black sails. Bowen's mouth made the words as if they tasted of tar. "And a knight's hand cut off at the wrist and replaced by a story." He looked at Jon with the care one might look at a man in a narrow boat with a hole. "Stannis Baratheon comes walking on the sea like a passage from a book." Sam made a soft, unhappy sound. Jon thought of Melisandre's eyes. He had seen the Red Priestess at Dragonstone, seen the way she drank a room when she looked at it. He remembered a night in a cave with a woman whose words ran ahead of her in the dark like small paws. He looked to Bowen, to Cotter. "How far?" "Near enough to see us seeing them," Cotter said. "They'll be in by dusk, if the wind doesn't change its mind and try to drown us all for a jest." By dusk the first of the ships lay clawed to Eastwatch's piers with ropes stiff as old sinew. The men who came off them came in quiet, the way men did when they had not eaten well and had learned recently what silence could keep from others. Jon rode along with Cotter and a little party of black cloaks to meet their party. His hood deep, ghost pacing ghost's own mind. He saw the man with the lantern jaw and the thick brow, the coal-retained stare that turned on a thing and did not turn away from it, the hair like iron dust. Stannis Baratheon needed no embroidery. He wore his kingship like mail under rough weather. It weighed him down and kept arrows out. Beside him walked a man with a face that could have been carved from a potato the size of a head, scars written on it in a handful of lines, eyes that looked on the world kindly and spoke to it sternly. Ser Davos Seaworth did not need introduction either. The Red Woman was not at Stannis' shoulder but a little behind, moving like fire deciding what to burn. Her gaze fell across Jon and moved on and then returned, curious, the way a cat's attention does when it suspects something small and alive under a chair. "Who speaks for the watch?" Stannis' voice came across like the wind, not raised but carrying. "I do for the moment," Jon said, and it felt like a lie because he did not want it to be true. "Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell," Stannis said without cruelty. It sounded like a reference, not a judgment. He looked toward the wall as a man looks toward an old debt. "It is bigger than they taught me." "They don't teach it," Jon said. "They make you stand on it and find your own names for it." Ser Davos's mouth did a small pleasant thing that was not a smile but had the idea of one. He raised his hand, his left hand whole, and Jon saw the stump of the right wrapped in clean linen and tucked under a sleeve with a sailor's competence. "It keeps out weather and wolves," Davos said, "but not the things the weather carries. Do you have words that are yours but smell of other men's breath?" Stannis said to Jon as if its sense mattered to him. "I am told the wildling king sits in my kingdom as if it were a stool he needed to rest on. Mance Rayder has sat in places that would refuse a southern's weight," Jon said. "He sat in a cave of black ice where the cold sings and you feel it in your teeth. He sat at the foot of a weirwood that has seen more winters than we have words for. He sits on the ground when he can. He does not care much for stools." He did not mean to speak so much, but Stannis had asked a true question, and true questions deserve more than a pointed answer. Stannis absorbed it. It was like watching a man drink a cup and not yet taste it. "If he is a king, he will parley," Stannis said. "If he is only a thief of titles, I shall be happy to be relieved of the tedium of talking." "He will parley," Jon said. He felt the words decide themselves under his tongue, their weight lodging behind his teeth. "He would like to parley with you, would he?" Stannis looked to Davos as if measuring his shadow. "He has burned villages. He has gathered families," Jon said. "Like a winter gathers bones," Stannis said, and then nodded as if to himself. "We cannot keep them all on the other side of the wall and take the north for mine at once." Davos smoothed the edge of his beard with the heel of his left hand. "Some truths make good friends of men who would not otherwise meet," he said mildly. The red woman's eyes were on Jon again, and now there was recognition in them, a small narrowing that had taken on the shape of hunger when he had seen it in other mouths. "You have shadows in you," she said with the intimacy of a mother noticing a scar at her child's knee. "And a name that belongs to more than one branch." "I have a place," Jon said, "and work to do." He did not look at her thinking of a cave where he had taken another woman's hands, because to look at a fire and think of the dark was to give it fuel. "It will be a weirwood glade," Stannis announced. "No banners but mine, no blades drawn but eyes. Ser Davos, have we enough honor among those who stand around me to make that mean anything?" "Your Grace," Davos said, and the words had a steadiness to them that seemed to lend Stannis height. "You have honor enough for men who come lacking, and Jon Snow's men know the rules of talking on the wrong side of a wall. The free folk know them as well." "Then say it," Stannis told Jon. "Say that I have called for a meeting under the trees. Say I will offer the terms of a king and demand a king's due. Say that those who try to cheat a king's meeting will be treated as something less than men." Jon did not look for Bowen Marsh to see the disapproval. He didn't need to. Disapproval had a shape in a room. It made the corners look shyer. He went. The forest received him as if it had been expecting him. He rode with two other brothers and Ghost and a strip of gray daylight that wrapped itself more tightly around their group the farther they went from the cut of the wall. The glade they found had snow cupped in the hollows of old roots. The weirwood there had a face that had washed itself pale with much snowmelt and rain, and the eyes were the red of a wound that would not consent to scab. Jon felt calm standing in the tree's sight, the way a man might feel in a silent room with an old teacher who had never raised a hand to him. Mance Rayder came among the trees with the ease of a man who had never learned to ask them permission. He wore a shirt of fine steel rings under a black cloak lined with white, and a little light caught at the edge of a torn bit of gold embroidery at his throat, the memory of a life he had thrown back like a fish too small to keep. Tormund Giantsbane came at his side, red beard full of snow and full of words it had not yet said. Behind them, women. Dalla with her belly round and her eyes unaccountably serene, and Val with her hair like honey poured in winter, set with ice. There were others, antler-helmed, bone-laced, painted, scabbed. They were a people woven from hard threads. "You've a new friend," Mance called as he walked, before he was near enough for the words to strike. I knew the scent of kings once, when I was foolish in a different set of clothes. There's one on the wind. Not just any king, Tormund said. The one with the tight jaw who looks like he's always swallowing a coin he doesn't like the taste of. The woman in red warms him while he's not looking. We made a meeting, Jon said. We did. Mance stood in the weirwood's eye and looked into it frankly, like a man who did not fear the judge because he had been a judge himself in some earlier life. I hope your new friend knows how the old gods listen. They do not blink at bright banners. Stannis arrived as the wind shifted and shook the snow in the trees so that it fell in little handfuls on the glade like a blessing or a warning. He came without his crown but with his sword on his hip and his command on his shoulders. With him came Ser Davos and the Red Woman, and a close ring of men whose faces had the scraped look of salt and long oars and a sense that the sea was a floor one could walk on with care. They halted at the glade's edge as if there were a line cut there in the air. Mance Rayder, Stannis said. He did not make a question of it. You have sat too long in my sight. Mance smiled the way a man smiles at a child who returns a stick to him in a complicated way. You have good watchers, he said, and too few of them. You have too many people, Stannis said. Dalla clicked her tongue softly, not disapproving but noting. That's a new kind of complaint. We can both empty our quivers of truth, Ser Davos suggested, and see whether crows come to drink from our blood for the trouble. The Red Woman's gaze slid to Dalla and to the curve of her abdomen. The world comes fresh from the fire in that one, she said, soft with wonder. Do you know what it is to carry a light, girl? Dalla's smile was not a weapon or a hand held out. It was a candle. I carry a child, she said. He kicks me and wants his supper. Tormund barked a laugh that made two crows rise from the nearer tree. She carries Tormund's swear words, he said. I put them in that child every time I drink. He squinted at Stannis. You look like you never drink enough. Your piss must be the color of a melted candle. That isn't healthy. Stannis's mouth tightened but did not lose its curve to anger. He turned to Jon. Tell him, he said, and Jon tasted an oddly sour flattery in the order. Tell him what I will offer. Jon looked from king to king and felt like a bridge thrown across a chasm by a man who would be the first to test it with his weight. You cannot remain on that side of the wall, he said to Mance. Not when the dead were seen walking at the fist of the first men. Not when the others ride. The wall keeps men out and cold out, but it does nothing for those who are on the wrong side when winter decides which side it wants. Stannis Baratheon is not wrong in this. You cannot stay where you are. Mance's eyes did not move from Jon while Jon said that. When Jon finished, Mance tilted his head back slightly and looked past Jon to the man who had not yet used more words than a paring knife. Go on, he said to Stannis. You will bring your people through my wall, Stannis said. In return, you will bend the knee. Tormund snorted. Mance did not. That's a lot of knee, he observed. I've got 1,000 farther than my counting and 9,000 farther than my patience. Also, a knee isn't mine to give. The word bend doesn't much care for me. It need not love you, Stannis said. It must obey. The realm is not a song sung by whichever voice can shout the loudest in a hall. It is a law. Law is a door with a lock. And the free folk, Mance said amiably, are the ones who learned how to climb out the window. Ser Davos cleared his throat. Your Grace, he said, with the courtesy of a man stepping between two bulls and dropping a sheaf of hay at their feet. I have seen a law sink a ship because the captain held to it after the wind had changed. There is a way with the wind and a way against it, and there is a way that says, get your cargo to the pier and be damned to the pages of books. Stannis's eyes did not leave Mance's, but they softened by a breath while he listened to Davos. Say the cargo. The lives, Davos said. The women and the children are cargo before they are contraband. Mance's smile sharpened. Will your law call us thieves again when our children are warm? It will call you subjects when your knees are bent, Stannis said. Then he surprised his own face by adding, or when your word is held as tightly as if it had been bent. I will have fealty. It can come to me standing or kneeling. The red woman's attention had slid back to Dalla's belly and fixed there with a concentration that felt like prayer from someone who did not kneel. Jon felt Ghost's muscles ripple through his pelt when the animal's skin crawled with a reaction that was not precisely fear. Melisandre's lips moved around a sound like the idea of a name. Jon looked away. Mance drew in breath, let it out again. He stepped forward a half-pace. Into the white. "My terms, your grace," he said, and there was the smallest wry bow in the use of the styling. "I will bring my people through your wall, and I will stand beside you with a blade in my hand when the cold ones come down out of the places where they sleep. I will keep my men from your villages and keep their hands off your daughters and their axes off your sheep. I will do this not because your law tells me to, but because I choose to, and because otherwise my people die. In return, I ask for land in the gift. We'll take the stones your long dead left there and we'll make them live again. We will give hostages for our good behavior, if that is the way of your law. There are men I trust with their sons, and I will ask them if their sons wish to be trusted." He did not look back, but Jon saw the way Val's head tilted at that, listening closely. "That is one leg of a stool," Stannis said. "We need 3. "You'll set your bottom just the same," Tormund muttered, but his eyes were on Mance, proud and a little surprisingly hopeful. Stannis stood under the weirwood's white bones for a moment and let the wind touch his face and moved not at all. "You will," he said slowly, as a man reads from a page and checks each word before letting it go. "Acknowledge me as your king. You will not raid the south. You will fight when I call you to fight and go where I send you. And you will give me your son." It felt to Jon as if the snow had changed color in that moment, and the wind had changed its mind. It was not what he had expected Stannis to say, and yet of course it was, and he was angry with himself for having expected anything gentler. Melisandre did not take her eyes from Dalla's belly, and yet somehow, when Stannis spoke of the sun, she moved closer without taking a step. Mance's face did not alter much. The smile went away. The corners of his mouth smoothed into the kind of line that might be a scar one day. His head did not turn toward Dalla because to turn it would be to admit that something there needed seeing. Tormund filled the space where his king did not speak. "What use does a king of Southron men have for a wildling babe?" Tormund laughed, but it walked with a limp. "He'll not pay your debts at whatever bank you've got your boots in." Stannis's eyes flickered briefly in the direction of Melisandre, which was the smallest of betrayals, and then back to Mance, which was the largest attempt at repair. "Blood draws fire," he said. "Ask your own trees." Dalla laid a hand atop the curve of her belly and looked at the red woman. "I have another tree," she said. "It tells me to eat and keep quiet and sleep when I can. It is not so hungry as yours." Jon heard his own voice before he had decided to give it to the air. "Your grace," he said to Stannis, "let the law be heavy enough without this. Take hostages of men, not of babes. The Ironborn keep boys to keep their fathers honest. So might you." Davos stirred and offered his quiet to the king. "There's a way to make 2 men your subjects and not one enemy of 3,000, he said. "I haven't put my hand in many books, your grace, but I've weighed a deck against a storm. You want these people to stand in a shield wall when the dead come walking. Men won't lift their shields beside the man who took their child." Melisandre's voice came very soft, a sound like steam rising from snow. "A king needs his fire. Then he can marry one," Val said coolly, and for a breath everyone looked at her, because insult makes a good path across a frozen river. "Or light one in his own bed, if he's able. He will not have this one." No one scoffed at her. Swords rusted slower than courage at the wall, Jon thought. The weirwood creaked. It was only a branch adjusting its burden of snow, but when branches speak over old red eyes, men listen. Stannis looked to the tree and then to Mance Rayder, and when he spoke again some of the iron had turned to steel, still hard but tempered. "Hostages," he said. "Men of the free folk who will live among my men and sit at my tables and learn the ways of the south, and whose fathers will keep their hands honest because they miss their sons. I will have 3 for 1,000. "I'll give you boys," Mance said, "who can tell a fork from an axe, just, and who aren't too old to learn the difference between knighthood and a good boot knife." He took a breath and let it out as frost. "Not mine. Not yours," Stannis agreed without quite looking at Melisandre. "We will write this on paper. We will remember," Mance said. "Paper burns. Then we will keep it in two places," Ser Davos said lightly. "One in a chest that likes the cold, and one in men's mouths where they can tell the story again when the chest goes missing." They stood under the trees and made, without smiles, something that was not a friendship and not a war. The words were not perfect, and yet they were better than spears. The Red Woman turned away at last from Dalla's belly, as if an animal had been denied a scent and would look for it elsewhere. She looked at Jon with a knowing that made him meet her eyes, because to drop his own would be to drop more than that. Her lips shaped words without speaking them. The name of his father, or the name of the father he had been told, or both. They came down from the glade and returned to their little cities. Stannis set his men to loading and unloading and carrying and counting and building fires where men could warm their hands two at a time. Cotter Pike set his East Watchers to watching the East more fiercely than ever. If the sea had brought a king, it could bring a kraken. Bowen Marsh counted barrels and then counted them again, because when the numbers were wrong he could correct them by believing harder. The day passed into a color that was not quite any color at all. Jon slept in snatches, and in one of them he dreamed of a door he could not open because he was also the door, and when he woke, Maester Aemon was sitting by a candle with a raven on his shoulder whispering things into his ear. "You will have to walk them through," Aemon said, as if the dream were a message he had intercepted. "Hate will be the last to cross." "What will be the first?" Jon asked. "Cold," Aemon said. "Or hunger." The business of allowing a people through a wall that had been built to keep them out taught a man many uses for rope and for patience. They opened the gate in the shadow of the main castle, and the great timbers groaned like a wounded ox. Jon thought of the sound the weirwood had made in the glade when its snow shifted, and decided it was the same sound in a different language. The first through were women with children clutched in shawls and on backs. Then older men with staves who had once been younger men with pride. Then wagons with bones in them, in one case literally, and ancestors' wrapped bones would not be left out in the weather. Then came the warriors, in 2s and 3s and 10s and 20s, with axes low and eyes lower, measuring each southern stone as if it had been laid to trick them. Tormund came on foot, his voice a horn for those who had none, shouting at men who wanted to swagger and at boys who looked as if swagger might be the only thing they had to wear. "Your axe is heavy because you haven't used it today," he told one who jostled a brother in black for the pleasure of a shoulder. "Save your jostling for a thing that will jostle you back. And mind your spear, you'll poke the eye of the man who'll save your life tomorrow." When the first giant came through the gate, the wall sounded again. Perhaps it was only the giant's weight sending a message down into the old ice. He ducked his head and brought with him a smell of mammoth and wool and a kind of sadness. His eyes were too human for the story men told themselves about giants in songs. Some men on the walkway spat or made the sign of their gods. Sam stared with frank fascination and then remembered to be afraid and then forgot again. Jon walked down beside the giant and felt himself small, and then felt that smallness become a kind of ease. A big man removes from the air the pressure to fill it. They made a camp on the south side in the Gift, where old stones stood like broken teeth and new fires licked at the edges of the day. Stannis' smelters found a place to build a forge, and his carpenters found a stand of good pine that Jon's men swore had been waiting 100 years for an honest axe. The Red Woman built no fire of her own, but stood beside others, as if she were studying a subject she had purchased. Dalla, tired but uncomplaining, lay down in a tent pitched with a view of the weirwood's crown showing above the way of the wall. Val paced like a white fox and came back to Dalla to hold her hand without much tenderness and with more love than the tenderest hand often holds. Jon moved among men and resolved quarrels about places and pots and the right names for things. And if he did this without complaint, it was because he had too little breath for anything but the saying of necessary words. He took those to the king's tent when it was required. Stannis liked his tent stark and orderly, and it had a shelf all ready for parchments and a stack of old laws taken from chests as if to remind the air around him who it belonged to. Ser Davos moved like a man who had learned to occupy the space left between two stones when the sea fell back. Your brothers will spit over their own boots when they sleep, Stannis said to Jon without looking up from the paper. They will wake drowned. Some, Jon admitted. Others have learned to count the winters they have left and don't want to spend them choosing between the manners of a dead southerner and those of a living Northman. They'll stand a watch with Tormund if he stands it with them. They won't stand one with Rattleshirt. But he won't stand one with them. He won't, Davos agreed. There are men who make a poor meal of brotherhood. They choke on it. Stannis set down his quill and rubbed 2 fingers over the bridge of his nose, as if the skin there had grown suddenly too tight. It will be the Boltons next, he said, almost to himself. I will set a good man in Winterfell, and he will sit there because I say so and because the man who says otherwise will find himself short ahead. It will be the Karstarks and the Umbers and the Manderleys after that. I'll count them and set them in their places. Else the North is a table with 1 leg shorter than the others. Your Grace, Jon said, measuring his words because what he was about to say wanted badly to run fast and fall. That will be the business of a winter. The business of tomorrow is getting Mance's men to believe that being called subject does not mean slave, and getting mine to believe that calling a man free does not mean he's beyond law. Stannis regarded him with that steadiness that had a blade laid behind it. When I was a boy, he said, my maester showed me a picture of Aegon's table on Dragonstone and told me it is the shape of the world. There were no borders on it, only mountains and rivers and the sea at the edges of all things. It gave me a rash on my mind. I prefer a map with lines. A table with no borders is easier to eat at with many, Davos said. I'll teach it to grow lines, Stannis said, but not while the others walk. Even a stubborn man can count in cold. The parley had its echo in another meeting, less formal and more fraught, that took place in the common hall when the first wave of free folk had found sleeping space in the barracks and the stables and had learned that the night's watch's stew was thin but hot. Janos Slynt stood up on a bench and announced in a ringing tone that sounded like guilt pretending to be courage that the watch was not a brothel where wild women could put their children to sleep. And a then with blue lines tattooed along his brow like a god's finger marks told Janos in blunt terms that if he said the word brothel again his tongue would be a mark on the floor. Jon did not have to raise his voice to quiet them because Maester Aemon cleared his throat, and the sound of it had something like gentleness in it that reminded grown men of teachers and warned them of how foolish they had once looked in certain rooms. You will rise in the morning, Aemon said, and you will be tired. If you rise angry, you will be tired and angry. There is no strength in that. If you rise hungry, you will be tired and hungry. There is no strength in that either. We have no food for anger. Sam repeated this later to Jon in the rookery when the night stretched, pleased with the balance of the words. He makes things smaller so we can carry them, he said. Words are lighter than logs, Jon said, and staggered under his own. He visited Dalla at Val's insistence because Val had come to him with her own kind of order. Men in red want what my sister carries, she said. You wear black, but they look at you as if you might be red when they are not watching. Come and learn the difference. He followed her across the churned snow of the yard and into a tent warm with breath, where Dalla smiled up at him from her bed of furs. You carry rooms with you, she said, as if it were a joke. Some men carry storms. You are not that kind. I have storms, Jon said. I try not to bring them inside other people. Dalla's hand moved over her belly with the slow certainty of someone smoothing a page she meant to read again. You are a boy who learned to be a man where men's names are hard to keep, she said with no claim to second sight. You will tell your king that I don't give him my son. He has plenty of men who call him your grace and mean my fear. He can have 3 if he wants, who will call him that and mean my oath. I'll tell him, Jon said. He had already, in language different and the same. Val looked at him with a measuring that had nothing to do with his face. And you'll tell him what you are, she said. Bastard and brother and something else. He will want the something else more than the others. Keep it out of his hands. He did not say how. He said, I will try. The days turned like an ox-cart wheel, slowly and with a terrible honest creak. Lines gathered on maps. Lines gathered on faces. Lines gathered in the pages of Eamon's ledger as the maester made lists of the children who had come, the old who would go, the men who could hold a spear without trying to prove a point to it. Stannis sent riders south to feel the land and returned their frostbitten hands with orders stitched to them. He sent letters to the mountain clans in a script that had not learned how to supplicate. He took counsel with a sea-smelling knight and a woman who saw burning truths in burning wood, and with a bastard of Winterfell who did not know how to listen without hearing more than he wanted. Jon came to the Queen's men by the Red Woman's fire one night because she had asked for him by saying not that she wanted him, but that she needed a name for the thing in him that the fire liked to warm itself by. He stood with his back to the wall and watched the brazier's heart pulse. Melisandre's face looked very young in that light and very old in the shadow that the nose made when it turned between him and the flame. "I see a crown," she said without preface. "And I see a wolf with a man's eyes, and a man with a wolf's hunger. I see a sword that is not a sword. I see a woman using words to ask men to bring their children to the fire," Jon said. She did not look offended. "I did not ask," she said. "He did. He asked with the part of him that thinks it was made a king by men and the part that knows he was made a king by need. Most men are ruled by what is nearest to their bellies. Stannis Baratheon is ruled by a north that is not on any map." "The child," Jon said, because naming a thing kept it from multiplying in the dark, "is not for you. The child is for the night," she said. "We all are." He turned and went without a bow. Later, Ser Davos came up beside him as he walked and gave him a look from the corner of his eye, the way some men offer a cloak without remarking the cold. "You did a thing a man does when he thinks he is careful and is only brave," Davos said. "You told the truth to a fire and did not check your sleeve for sparks." "You told it to him," Jon said, meaning Stannis, meaning the thing about the child that had been given up and then taken back in the Weirwood's shadows. "I told him there was a ship that would not float if he pierced its sail to make a better place for his flag," Davos said. "He does not always understand ships. He understands storms." The first true test of the new thing they had made came when the cold sharpened one morning so suddenly that men woke with their water frozen in the cup beside their beds, and the horn sounded from the west gate with a fearful urgency that sent every man with hands and a heart toward the noise. A ranging party led by a then had returned not with meat but with a story on their faces, and the story had blue eyes and moved in a way that frightened horses. They had left 2 men behind with second deaths and had not had time to take their heads. Jon took men, black brothers and free folk both, and rode out to the place where the trees grew unmistakably silent. He remembered the fist. He remembered his skin making a fist of its own. When they found the first body, the tracks around it told a tale that had ended recently. Jon had a brother take his head clean and quickly, and he had another brother build a pyre with a haste that had been hallowed by use. The second body was farther on and came up with a sound like ice cracking. It reached for the nearest man with hands that had forgotten the memory of warmth. Tormund waded in and split its neck with an axe that had previously made merrier work, and Ghost's mouth closed on a wrist that broke with a crystalline pop, and Jon's sword went in where the thing's throat would have been if it had been a man. The eyes went out like 2 candles someone had simply put their fingers over. Afterward, the men were quiet in that way that had no shame in it. It was the quiet of animals who had smelled a fire at night and learned their own names again. On the ride back, one of the free folk boys who had given himself as a hostage began to cry and tried not to, and a brother of the watch rode his horse up alongside and said, "That was right, lad," without asking for what that was. Jon watched that and told himself this was why he had stood between men and old words and asked them to make new ones. He told himself it was working. He did not quite believe himself, but he made a habit of telling the truth to his own ears nevertheless. When they came through the gate, the light was already sliding away beneath the wall. Stannis stood with Melisandre beside the brazier, as if he had been waiting for the sight of men returning with smoke in their hair. The king's eyes found Jon the way a magnet finds iron. "How many?" he asked. "2, Jon said, "and 2 after that. Not ours." "I would like to make mine of them," Stannis said. "An enemy with a face is a pleasure." "Winter gives you pleasure?" Tormund barked out incredulity and a laugh as if Jon had told a joke and he'd decided to go along with it. "Your Grace, You'd be a terrible drinking companion. I'd sooner choose the giant. He tells a better story and doesn't argue with his cup. I do not drink for pleasure, Stannis said. Then you do it wrong, Tormund said. The night settled like a lid. In the hours that followed, Jon imagined the old gods opening an eye and peering down like someone deciding whether to water a plant. He thought of his father Ned and the room in Winterfell where the light came watery through the high windows and lay in sheets on the stone floor like winter caught and folded. He thought of his father's voice saying law and his uncle's voice saying love and wondered if the two were just different names for the same ache when the right men spoke them. He was walking to the yard for drills at first light when Stannis came upon him with the steps of a man who had already decided to say a thing and would say it no matter who afterward died. Jon Snow, he said, you have a father's name and a wolf's coat. I will give you a different name and a different coat. I have a name, Jon said, and it felt oddly ungrateful at the instant that he was also grateful to be able to say it. Bastard is not a name, Stannis said. It is a joke the noble play on their sins. I will make you Stark. I will set you in Winterfell. You will hold it for me. I will tie the North to my law. The air had a taste like iron in it, the taste blood leaves on a lip after one has fallen on ice. Jon looked past Stannis at nothing and then back at the king. I swore a vow. Stannis made a sound that had contempt in it, but not all of it directed at Jon. Men make vows to make themselves brave, he said. They keep them to make themselves foolish. I have seen it enough to be done with it. Your Grace, Jon said, and he felt suddenly very tired down in the part of him that usually had good legs. I swore this one to stand between the realm of men and what comes for it in the dark. It's not a small thing. You have their swords. He nodded toward the camp where free folk cooked their bacon over southern fires. For the dark, let me have my black cloak for yours. Stannis's mouth tightened. You will die in it, he said, not unkindly, just like a carpenter remarking on grain before making a cut. Maybe, Jon said. He looked at his hands. They were not as young as they had been. I'll try not to today. The king's eyes slid toward the fire where Melisandre waited with her strange patience. They came back to Jon and weighed him and decided to leave him on the balance for later. When Stannis turned to go, Ser Davos lingered, patient where Stannis was precise. A man who keeps a hard promise makes a good stone to build with, Davos said, as if offering advice about walls to a mason. But even good stones must be set with something between them, else they crack with the weather. Mortar, Jon said. Mercy, Davos said, which is just a mason's way of letting each stone lean a little on its neighbor. Jon went out into the yard and put his blade into air and wood in equal measure. The air took it better. The day moved. Men who had not been brothers became comrades at the edge of a fire, if not at the center of it. Boys who had not been anything but cold became hostages who would one day be men who had eaten at a king's table and learned to understand a fork. The Red Woman studied not one belly but many and found fires enough to keep her hands warm. Dalla laughed in the middle of the day and then tired and slept, and Val sat and watched her and quietly sharpened a knife in a way that was not ominous, only practical. Knives wanted attention or they wandered. Sam found Gilly a place near the rookery where the sound of the ravens made the baby quiet down, as if he were listening to a story told in an old voice. Days later came a message from the south, carried by a rider who had a flayed man's sigil fixed to his cloak with thawed pride and a mouth too ready to deliver cruelty, as if it were the coin he had been paid to spend. The Boltons had taken Winterfell and the Dreadfort's banners were teaching the wind new shapes. Stannis read it and folded the paper as if closing a wound and told the rider to eat in the mess and then be careful what cup he took in hand if he did not want to drink death with his supper. He looked at Jon and said, "The work does not wait." "It never does," Jon said, and watched Stannis take the measure of his newly allied host the way a man takes the measure of a blade he has never swung. He watched Mance point his men to lines on the map that led through the snow like truths too plain to argue with. He watched the women of the free folk weigh the south with eyes that did not trust it, and then tie their babies to their backs and go to fetch wood from the stand of pine. Stannis had already had men count. On a morning of dull iron color, he stood once more atop the wall with Ghost at his side. The wind pawed them as before. The The forest stood where it had stood, watchful and old. Smoke rose in controlled threads from the camps to the south and the west, and even from 1 or 2 points to the north. Some things cannot be prevented and must be watched. He put his hand again on the old ice and felt nothing but the cold. Snow began to fall in a slow deliberation like thought. He felt not hope, it was not a word he trusted, but the presence of something that would not go away when asked. He did not name it. The wind would have taken the name and made a joke of it. Down below, a horn sounded 3 long notes and then 2 shorter, and the sound stitched itself into the air. Men turned their heads. Wolves raised theirs. Jon listened for the pattern that would turn worry into work, and when he heard it, he put his hand on Ghost's thick ruff and felt the animal's warm life, and then he moved. He did not think of thrones or tables or names someday written in the margins of a maester's book. He thought of gates and ladders and men who needed their hands learned to the tasks in front of them. The kingdom could wait while the work got done. Kings might not understand that. Wolves did. By the time he reached the yard with his orders to be given and had given them, by the time Tormund had bellowed something rude that made men grin and hold their spears more easily, by the time Stannis had come out into the light with his shadow of a crown on his head and Ser Davos had come with him carrying his good common sense like a lamp, the snow had decided to be a storm, and the world narrowed again to what a man could do with the strength of his back and the will to put it where it was needed. In such weathers, the tales of politics and prophecy fell asleep like cats. But cats wake in the end because they cannot help themselves. In the tents where a woman lay breathing and the child in her turned his face toward the southern air as if he had heard his name, the red woman's fire burned very bright and very still. Val sat on her heels and watched the door, and her knife was in her lap, bright as a first tooth. Somewhere far away, or very near, trees listened to the making of new words. When at last the afternoon bowed to the early night, Jon found a moment alone beside the small patch of weirwood that thrust its bones above the snow southeast of the wall. He stood without speaking because in the presence of old things speech often felt like theft. The tree said nothing, which did not mean it was silent. What it held pressed against the air in a way that made him feel the weight of his cloak and the weight of his choices and the weight of the 2 men he had helped lead to each other who would otherwise have tried to lead their swords to each other's hearts. He remembered Mance's half-smile and Stannis's unbending eyes, Davos's scarred hand on the hilt of his good sense, Melisandre's face, pale and fervent like someone who had given up food to eat only light. He made no prayer. He did not strictly know how. But he lifted his head and let the snow sting his skin and permitted the cold to write its message across his cheeks. And he set himself to the next task, and then the one after that. The rest would come. The rest always came. In the space between those comings, a man kept his promises, and when a man kept his promises in a place like this, it made a sound. He thought, absurdly, of Aemon's ravens, muttering through their beaks the syllables of the old speech, and if he smiled at that, he did not feel it freeze on his lips. Night brought troubles. Men who had drunk more than they could afford of Stannis' stores, boys with knives who had not yet learned that there is a difference between the play of blade and its work, a pair of brothers fighting across a line chalked on the floor by a free woman who wanted them to stay on their own side. But night also brought the sight of lanterns moving in a sequence across the yard, a kind of thread sewn to keep a tear from spreading. Jon lay down at last with Ghost's breath, a steady warmth near his boots, and he let the iron taste leave his mouth, and he slept. He woke to a shout and the smell of wood smoke and a sound he had not heard before at the wall. Laughter large as a door opening where a wall had been, laughter that belonged to a man with a red beard full of secrets and a stomach full of someone else's stew. It had the ring of hope, which was not a word he liked to touch. He got up to see it, because even the words a man does not trust deserve to be inspected when they wander in from the cold. He stepped out into the yard and was met by Tormund's grin as it broke in half to make space for another grin inside it. "She's a mother," Tormund shouted before remembering to lower his voice for the sake of women and gods. He lowered it and started again. "She's a mother, Jon Snow," and the boys got a cry like a good horn. Jon did not ask, "Whose boy?" There were boys enough. But he knew the one Tormund meant, and when he went to Dallas' tent he knocked and entered as if it were a small chapel in a free country. Dalla lay pale with the work her body had done and serene with the knowledge that the work had been worth it. Val held the child for him to see, with a look that said she would cut the hand that reached without words. The baby's face was red and collapsed in on itself like a miniature apple left near a hearth, and when it cried it made the sound Tormund had described, a clear reed note that seemed to set something vibrating inside Jon's ribs. "Monster," Tormund said fondly from behind him, and the name, rude and ridiculous and tender, made Dalla laugh until she cried a little with the pain of having laughed. Melisandre stood in the door of the tent, and the snow made a strange wreath for her hair. She looked long at the child and then at Dalla, and Jon felt in the air the making of a demand that would be a battle more dangerous than any with axes. Val's hand tightened on the knife in her lap. Jon stepped a half-pace so that he stood inconveniently in the door and made the space around the red woman smaller. "Light comes where it will," Melisandre said softly, though to whom she spoke was unclear. "And it goes again. We can only ask it to stay." "Then ask," Val said. Her eyes were brighter than the snow in her hair. Melisandre's gaze moved from the knife to Val's face and then to Jon's. For once there was no smile in it, no insinuation. Only, perhaps, understanding that sometimes the door a woman means to pass will be watched, and that she must choose another. Stannis did not come to the tent. Jon was grateful for that. He went later to the king's tent to tell him what had happened. That a child had been born, that it was a boy, that he had cried like a horn, that men had laughed. Stannis listened and nodded once. "Then a thing has been added to the world," he said. "We will see whether it was weight or feather." Outside, the storm spent itself and let the night stare in. The wind turned and came now from the sea, and it carried salt and the half-promise that the world had more than one edge. Jon stood for a time on the steps below the great cleft in the wall of the main castle, where men used to sit in summers and smoke while they watched the ravens fly. He thought of those summers the way a man thinks of a tale his mother told him. Too beautiful to be true and therefore probably not a lie. Ghost leaned against his leg, a warm white weight. Jon laid a hand on the direwolf's head and felt the skull under the fur, the life under the skull. When he went back inside, he passed the place where Maester Aemon slept. The old man's breath came like the pages of a book turning in a slow wind. Jon would have stood and listened to it for hours had he not been needed elsewhere. Men needed, the work needed, kings needed, and so did babies. The wall needed very little and yet demanded everything. He moved through the corridors with a lantern, and the lantern painted his shadow on the stones in long, faithful strokes that followed where he led. He was a son in those shadows, and a brother and a bastard and something else, and the something else waited, patient as a wolf, until the snow stopped falling and the old gods opened their eyes again. Snow spent itself and left the air clear as glass, so clear that when a man spoke his breath made shapes that looked, to a fanciful eye, as if words had been hanging there all along waiting for someone to lay claim to them. The morning after the boy's first thin cry, the yard wore a hush that was not quite reverent. Men did not pray much in the shadow of the wall so much as make arrangements with their gods, but something gentled the hands that passed firewood and the shoulders that took it. Work done in the presence of new life had a different weight. It was the difference between lifting a stone to build a wall and lifting the same stone to set it at a hearth. Jon found Maester Aemon awake at his table with his quills, the old man's fingers thin as the quills themselves. His mouth turned down in the permanent expression of someone who had outlived all his favorite jokes. A raven on the back of his chair watched Jon with an eye as bright as a question. "You heard," Jon said. "I hear a great deal," Aemon said, and touched the raven's breast with the back of a finger, its feathers black as spilled ink. "Not all of it from birds." He turned his head toward Jon and seemed to look past him, as if into the yard where men had wrapped their voices in wool that morning. "What do they call him?" "Mostly a horn," Jon said, and it drew an amused breath from him in spite of his intention to be stoic. "Tormund says he sounds like a good horn. Dalla hasn't said a name." He did not add that Val had named other things. A man who would not steal what was not offered. A woman who would lay down her life before she bowed to a fire. Names had been thick in the tent. Aemon reached out along the table with his palm open. The paper under his hand had a list on it written in his careful hand, thin and upright as a winter weed. "Bring him to me when they will allow it," he said. "Some names arrive from the mouth, some from the ear. A man must be ready for either." Jon nodded. He took the list and skimmed it, the tally of who had come through the gate and who had not. Beside some names, Eamon had drawn a small dot. He used dots where other men used tiers. Jon folded the page and slipped it into his sleeve as if it were a letter to be delivered later to the same room. "The dead were only 2 yesterday," he said. "That is a kindness." "It is a number," Eamon replied. "Kindness is what you do with numbers. 2 will speak to the men's sleep. You must go speak back to it." He went with a basket of kindling and a mind full of words that did not yet know their order. He stood in front of the men in the yard with the wall lifting its cold shoulder behind him, and he said what he had to say, plain as bread. He did not talk about kings or bargains or maps with lines. He talked about fires banked properly and spears carried with the point down when you walked and up when you stood, about how the dead did not love smoke and how men should. He told them what the horn would sound like if trouble came from the woods and what it would sound like if trouble came from the yard. He told them, because it was true, that the first time a man stood with a giant in the dark and waited to hear a footstep that did not come, he would stand a little straighter the second time because his back had learned itself. Tormund wandered in at the edge of the talk, nodding along as if the words belonged to him as much as to any, and when Jon finished, Tormund clapped his big hands together once in the cold as if to jar the day into motion. "What he means," Tormund bellowed, "is if you drop your spear point toward my foot again, I'll break it off in your arse, and the spear too. And if a dead thing touches you, you bite it before it bites you, and if it bites you first, you bite it anyway. We're not in the South yet. Here a man's teeth are as good as his knife." There was laughter, and some of it chipped away the ice. It helped more than the words, Jon knew, and he did not begrudge the help. He found Stannis at the map table afterward, the king's hair standing up in unhelpful directions as if his crown had once rested upon it and refused to leave without making a fuss. The parchment was a battlefield of black lines and small wooden pieces shaped like shields and towers, and the king's finger moved across it like a stiff wind. Ser Davos stood at his shoulder bearing the expression of a man watching a man with a blade he respected on a surface he did not. "Arnulf Karstark sends assurances," Stannis said without looking up. "Men send assurances when they are about to do the opposite. I prefer silence. Silence has fewer lies in it." "Arnulf is an old man," Davos said. "Old men like their words the way they like their soup, thick and familiar. He has a boy eager to be a man in a hurry." "That is a dangerous sort of boy," Stannis said. "It is the only sort of boy," Davos replied, and when Stannis glanced sideways at him, Davos folded his hands without apology. Stannis drew a small wooden bear from a pouch and set it near the place ink had scribbled a forest. "The Mormonts will remember that I held their weirwood oath in a closed hand and did not ask for their daughters' throats." His mouth flattened. "What I did not ask for, others will. This is the North. They kill men politely or not at all." His eyes came up to Jon then. "Your wild king. If I send him south with 1,000 as scouts, will he go?" Jon did not answer immediately. He thought of Mance's half-smile in the glade, of the way he wore the memory of a black cloak like a man wears a scar when he is too busy to explain it. "He will if he thinks the road is his to choose," Jon said. "If you tell him where to look, he'll look at it until he has seen enough. If you tell him where to put his feet, he'll step on yours." Stannis considered that as if it were another wooden piece to be placed. "I have too few men to afford my pride," he said. "I will put him where he'll do the most good and the least mischief. That suggests a road that others avoid." His finger brushed the map and came to rest south of the gift where the inked lines thickened into a suggestion of bog and scrub. "The Barrowlands," he said. "Old graves and open country. No trees to hide treachery, too much history to ignore. Send him with Tormund and a handful of my best eyes. They'll see the Boltons coming before the Boltons know they're seen." His mouth twitched, the king's version of humor. "If he runs, you'll have a king to hunt. I am told you can follow a stag through a wood when it is dead of winter and the wood is only tracks. Ghost follows, Jon said softly. I keep up as I can. Speaking of ghosts, Davos said, and extended 2 folded letters. One for you from the south. Maester Aemon asked me to bring it. One for the king from Eastwatch. Stannis took his and broke the seal with a nail-chewed blunt. Jon took his and held it a moment before opening it, as if letters could sweat through their sealing wax and reveal a lit plea of themselves to hands. The paper smelled faintly of smoke and some other thing he could not name. The hand was cramped and sprawling at once, the way a man writes when he tries to sound sober after wine. Wyman Manderley wished the Night's Watch all good fortune, and the ink between the lines wished the watch luck enough to choke on. Jon read it through twice and folded it again, pressing the crease with his thumb as if that would fold the tone into a kinder shape. Manderley offers food, he said when Stannis looked up to ask if he can see proof that the men coming south will be subjects and not raiders. He wants to send his own men to count them. He will not trust mine. He would rather count men he can punish later than men I can, Stannis said. He will count his coins while the world freezes around him and claim prudence. I will take his casks and his lies both. He tapped the letter in Jon's hand with a forefinger. Answer him with a courtesy. Tell him the watch's oath restrains the watch. Tell him the free folk's oath, such as it is, binds their hands for now. Tell him I will collect their rating in taxes and hang the worst of them if they forget their manners at his gates. He will believe none of it and send the food because he would not see Winterfell fed by a Baratheon while White Harbor starves. Men are rarely moved by love of others. They are commonly moved by fear of shame. Jon nodded. He looked down at the Manderley seal and thought of the fat lord smiling while he planned the shapes his smiles would make next. Then he looked up at the door and thought of the lean north beyond it where smiles were winter's rare birds, seen and then doubted later. Your Grace, he said, if Mance goes south with Tormund, I would send some of ours with him. Our what? Stannis asked, the edge of impatience under the words simply the blade's nature. Our brothers, Jon said. Men he knows by sight and name who wear black and will not take his orders, who will ride beside him and tell him what our horns mean if he hears them in the night. He will think better of us if he knows we eat the same cold meat he does. Stannis's eyes flicked beyond Jon to where the wall cast a shadow across the yard even indoors. I thought you did not want to send your strength south, he said. I don't, Jon answered, and felt the truth of that in his bones. But I don't want him lost to us either. Better we pay men now than pay for a mistake later. Davos made that small satisfied noise he made when someone else had put into words a thing he had been carrying around like a coin he wanted to spend. Stannis inclined his head. Choose them, he said. Not old men and not boys. Not fools. I have too many fools already. Bowen Marsh found Jon later and asked for a word as if he had found a coin and was not sure whether it was counterfeit. They stood in a corner of the yard where the wind could not find them easily, and Marsh's breath still smoked as if it did. We are watch, Bowen began, in the tone of a man laying a foundation stone and hoping the house would rise sturdier as a result. We are not a lord's levy. We are the realm's wall, Jon said. If stones must walk to stand where they are needed, then I am learning how stone grows legs. Marsh's mouth worked around a word and then rejected it the way a man rejects gristle. If you start sending our men south, the others will say you have put us in someone's colors. We swore ours. We have none to spare. Jon thought of the horn-voiced infant and of Aemon's dots. Do you remember the fist? He asked, quiet. How many men we had then and how many knives we had for them to hold. We learned a thing about counting. I am counting now, too. If a handful ride with Mance, they ride to make sure he rides for us and not away from us. It is not a lord's command. It is a brother's watch. Bowen Marsh's eyes softened at the corners as if the skin there were suddenly too loose for his skull. And who will watch you? He asked, only half in jest. Ghost, Jon said, because sometimes a jest wore armor over an honest question. And Sam. Sam, Bowen repeated, the word a sigh and a puff of steam both. He reads to ravens and the ravens talk back to him. Sometimes I think he is their maester and Eamon is ours. In the hall that night Mance took out his harp and made a sound with it that silenced spoons. He plucked the bones with a care that made even men who did not believe in songs look up and listen. He sang of a prince who wore a crown of flowers and a girl who made a wall of winter blossoms by saying a name. He sang of a stone city that did not yet know it would be called by another man's. He sang a song that had no words anyone understood, but that made the hair rise on Jon's arms with the memory of snow falling in a quiet that belonged to trees. Tormund threw his head back and added a harmony that sounded like a man singing while walking uphill. Dalla, pale and tired, smiled in a corner, and Val watched the room with her knife sheathed and her face unsheathed. When Mance finished, there was a little quiet in which men might have gathered themselves and decided to be moved or not. Then Tormund rose and said, "A song for a boy," and his big hand made a shape in the air as if to cradle something too small for it. He nodded at Eamon, who had come in on Davos's arm and sat by the fire as if it were an old friend whose jokes he had himself taught. The old man named kings in his youth. He can name a boy in his age. Eamon lifted his blind face. The fire wrote shadows on it that made the bones into script. "I named no kings," he said. "I refused one. It is not the same. Bring me the child." Val brought the child, not as if she obeyed, but as if the path she had chosen ran past the old man and she was content to walk it. She held the boy so that Eamon's hands could find the shape of his skull, the warm damp of his hair. Eamon's fingers trembled once and then were steady. "A good head," he said, as if he were measuring a cucurb for a maester's glass. "A good mouth for singing. A terrible cry, I am told." The tiniest of smiles lifted the corner of his mouth. "I would put a name on him that spends itself well over a long life. Names break before boys do sometimes, and a broken name cuts the tongue. I will name him for a man who chose books over crowns and good counsel over easy comfort and died under the care of brothers. If his mother consents." Dalla's hand lay across her belly where the curve had flattened by a breath. "I consent," she said, and the words seemed to ease something in the room that had not been tight but had been expectant. "Eamon," she said as if tasting it. "Eamon, Eamon." She smiled. "Monster," she added, because Tormund was watching, and laughter threw sparks into the air like would accepting a flame. It was a good night, by the standards of nights beneath a wall of old ice. Men slept without counting steps in their heads. Those whose dreams carried them to hard places found there a fire and a chair drawn up close to it and a cup of something hot. Stannis sent for Mance at dawn and set the plan upon him like a shirt measured the night before. Mance listened with his head slightly cocked, not deferring, only taking the sound of it into an ear that had been trained by another life to hear orders and return them as songs. "You want me to go south," he said, when the shape of it had been drawn and the numbers spoken aloud. "With 1,000 men who can melt like snow when snow wants to. You want me to look at roads like a wolf looks at a trap. You want me to count fires and sheep. I've done worse work. And I want you to report back," Stannis said. "That is the part men like you forget. You go, you look, you tell me what you saw. You do not become the story." "I've been a story before," Mance said, unoffended. He glanced at Jon. "Your brothers ride with me. Not fools, not boys. Not Queen's men either," Stannis put in. "You will not take my blue-blooded idiots and break them on a stone. I need them for later. I don't want your men who pray to their own shirts," Mance said and smiled around it. "They'd mistake a cloud for a command. Give me the ones who can see a deer in fog." Jon named them. Men who had kept their heads when others lost theirs at the fist. Men who could ride at night without convincing their horses to throw them out of pity. Iron Emmett. PYP, whose tongue ran faster than his legs but whose legs were no sluggards. Gren, who could carry twice what a man asked and complain only half as much as a man expected. A silent archer from the Shadow Tower with a face like an axe. He wanted to go himself and he did not ask. He knew better than to ask a thing when he already had the answer. They rode out at noon with the light lying flat across the snow like a cloth laid to keep a table from shining. Ghost went with them to the edge of the trees and then stood, fur rising a little along his spine, and placed himself in the path as if to say that was far enough. Jon stood with his hand on the direwolf's head and watched the column become less of a column and more of a thread through the woods, and then a string of beads, and then a suspicion of motion, and then nothing but a habit of expecting to see them. It was always like that when men went away. They left behind the memory of their shapes, and the air took those back as if it had loaned them. The day stretched. Jon walked its length twice. He went to Dalla's tent and found her asleep with the boy curled under her arm like a small warm secret. Val sitting with her knife across her knees and the forbearance of someone who had decided to wait men out and had discovered she was very good at it. He went to the rookery and listened to Eamon talk to the birds as if they were scribes he had been assigned to supervise without wanting to. He went to the yard and watched the giant one-weg one-dar-one, called one-one by those who had tongues to tangle over it, lift a post the weight of a horse with one hand to set it where a gate wanted a better hinge. A boy from the free folk stood next to him mimicking the motion with a stick and grinning at his own silliness. A brother of the watch laughed into his scarf and corrected the boy's hands. Janos Slint took the opportunity afforded by Stannis' preoccupation with maps to try again his luck at moving men with his voice. He chose the hall, and the hour men prefer to wash down their day with the flavorless hot comfort of stew. He chose the subject of honor and rights, and he chose words that he thought cut like good steel. "We are the Night's Watch," he declared, standing upon a bench that had not been built for sermons. "We keep our vows. We do not truckle to kings and wild men. We stand as we have always stood. If men will bring women into our halls and set babes at our hearths, then we will stand up from those hearths and leave them to it, for we have no place in such a house." He would have said more but found his words accompanied by a sound he had not expected. The scrape of a chair and a cough that cleared the throat not for speaking but for enduring. Maester Eamon stood. He did not often stand. It cost him. The hall made a sound like the sea when a wind slackens and then forgets itself. "I was a boy once," Eamon said, "and I thought honor was a word you kept in a box and took out only on feast days. Then I was a man, and I thought honor was a word that broke men if they did not wrap it carefully. Then I was an old man and saw that honor is a weather. There are days when it will drown you and days when it will dry everything you love and crack it. If you do not know how to walk in it without making yourself the only thing in the weather, you will die with a very clean name." He turned his head toward the bench Slint had borrowed. "Sit," Eamon said gently. "Eat if you can. If not, be hungry. But do not preach hunger as if it were virtue." Janos Slint sat. The stew cooled a little while men remembered there were spoons and mouths, and that there was work that would not do itself if they stayed in this room pretending it would. The night carried a different kind of cold. It came with stars that looked like chips hammered off an anvil and were as useful. Jon walked the top of the wall again and leaned his forearms on the ice and let the cold gnaw his bones until their ache made a sense. He thought of Stannis' offer and how the name Stark had sounded thrown across the space between them like a rope that would pull him up while skinning his palms. He thought of his father, and then of the other father who might be a story told by a harp, and then he told himself to think of neither. He thought of the choice in front of him: stay, hold, keep the gate open, count the fires, count the men, write the names. He did not know whether it was the harder choice. He only knew it was the one that made his sleep lighter. He dreamed he was in the crypts of Winterfell and the statues looked down at him with empty eyes and full knowledge. A blue flower grew from a crack in the stone and turned its face to him like a woman turning from sleep. He woke with his hand clenched on Ghost's ruff. The direwolf thumped his tail once. "You are not yet dead," and then did not move again. Riders came back on the third day before dawn, their horses moving like men after a long night. Mance led them bold, as if his body had not grown accustomed to tense and warm food, Tormund beside him with his beard frosted. Jon watched them thread through the yard and dismount and stand a moment as if telling their bones they had permission to relax. Mance found him and smiled without showing his teeth. There, he said, and spread a piece of cloth on the table that had once been white and was now the color of an old map. He had drawn with charcoal, rough lines, quick strokes that nevertheless found the shape of things. "The Dreadfort has men ranging, but not the sort who know how to smell a camp taught to hide," he said. Bolton's banners have walked to Winterfell and planted their long shadows there. They have food of a kind, salted harsh, flour that clumps in weather like this pig's not yet bled. Men who will do ugly things if you pay them enough, and of those a surplus. Numbers, Stannis asked, stepping into the circle with the words like coins. Enough to be smug, Mance said. Not enough to be slow. He jabbed a finger at the line he'd drawn for a river. The Bar Rollins will slow an army that knows only stone roads. Men who were boys in snow will find friends there. Stannis's eyes trained on the map with the hunger of a man who had been given a plate. The mountain clans? They will come if they know where to come to, Mance said. They watch the tops of their own houses like crows on a fence post. Send to the Little and the Norrie and the Wool. Send to the Burley and the Harkley. Send a man who remembers what to call their mothers. They will not answer to a red woman's letters. Stannis did not look at Melisandre, who had slipped in like heat himself. Davos, he said, you grew up in a city with narrower streets than any in the north. You can find a path through a tangle. I can find a path where there wasn't meant to be one, Davos said. But I'd as soon trust a Northman in his own hills. He glanced at Jon. You have a brother at Queen's Crown. I have brothers, Jon said. Not a castle. Send the ones with eyes, Mance urged again, and tapped the map with a forefinger. Here, here, and here. 3 fires in the night that burn low and need 3 different tales to explain them to men who look up. I'll put men along this run to lead your slower ones where the earth won't pull their boots off. Boots, Tormund groaned. We have boots now, and they're soft as children. Southron boots. They make a man lazy. It's a wonder any of you can feel the ground through these cakes on your feet. I saw a man fall on his arse because his boot slipped on a patch of air. Then take them off, Stannis said dryly. You'll not move slower for that. They made their measures and set their pieces and wrote in the air with fingers the routes that men would take along, routes that would be snow by the time they walked them. The alliance, such as it was, took on weight, the kind of weight plans have when they are about to climb into men's bones and make themselves comfortable there. Word from White Harbor came with half a smile concealed in the fat of its letters. Barrels of salt beef and pine-smoked fish would be sent north to aid in any lawful purposes of the Crown and the Night's Watch. A phrasing that braised its meat in legal sauce. The wagons began arriving drawn by horses whose eyes did not like the wall and by men whose eyes did. Men who had thought they could live forever within 3 days' ride of the sea came into the yard and used the word M-Lord, as if it were a prayer or a curse. They looked at giants and then looked away like men who had seen the sea's back heave in storms and noticed how small their boats were. Work gave the days their shape. The dead kept the nights honest. Twice more men rode out and came back with blue-eyed stories that had to be burned before breakfast. Each time there were fewer mistakes. When a man reached for a dead thing and failed to take the head clean, there was another hand there. When a boy cried, another boy made the sound smaller by making his own and then forgetting to keep making it. The smell of burning never left the camp. It clung to hair and to dreams. Melisandre's fire spoke to her, and sometimes she answered aloud. Jon passed her one night and heard, in a voice so low it could have been a thought rubbed between 2 fingers, I asked you to stay. He did not slow. He did not want to know which part of the night she had addressed. He went when she sent for him a day later because ignoring her would have been a statement he did not intend to make without more cause than annoyance. She stood beside her brazier with her hands out as if she were a thief warming them at a stranger's hearth. You should have taken the name, she said. It would have burned away through the snow for you. I have a name, he said. I have too many names. I can't keep taking them off and putting them on like a cloak. He looked at the brazier and felt the faint tug it made at his eyes. You saw a boy with a crown of snow, he guessed, half in mockery, half in weary resignation. I saw a wolf with a man's sorrow, she said, and the words pricked even though he had braced for something. I saw a king without a chair. I saw a sword that was only a word until it burned and then it was both. I saw a door in the earth. She turned her face toward him, and her eyes were not soft. Do you think I speak to your pride for pleasure, boy? I speak to your work. I speak because the night speaks to me, and if I refuse to answer, it will put another name in my mouth and make me answer with that. What does the night ask? For help, she said simply. It is big as the world and so very empty, and the emptiness is hungry. It wants to be filled with the sound of men dying. I would rather give it the sound of men living. That is not a prayer. It is a policy. The bluntness of the last word surprised him enough to make him laugh despite himself. You sound like Stannis, he said. She looked toward the king's tent where a shadow moved. Perhaps the man, perhaps only the idea of him, and let out a breath that warmed the cold air between them and vanished. Sometimes, she said, he sounds like me. On the day Mance rode again with Tormund and Jon's chosen handful, a wind came barbed out of the east and rode a chill into even the men who had learned to read cold as if it were a text. They had long studied. Jon stood with them at the gate and clasped forearms and said nothing dressed up. Watch for fires, he told PYP, and PYP grinned with lips that cracked and bled and said, I'll bring you a whole one in my hat. Gren clapped him on the back hard enough to make PYP's teeth rattle and promised to keep him from stumbling into any open graves. Iron Emmett took Jon's hand and squeezed it with a care that acknowledged bone and friendship both. The silent archer, named Dywin by some and called other things by others, touched 2 fingers to his eyebrow and nodded. Tormund hugged Jon and nearly broke his ribs, then whispered in his ear, If I die, I'll haunt your stew. Jon whispered back, You won't like that stew, and felt Tormund's laughter shake his own body. When they had gone, the yard felt larger and less full of breath. Jon turned to the work that would not leave him alone. He found Sam in the rookery with a book open on his lap, his finger in the margin as if to hold the page still while he learned to read it into the world. You look as if you have a plan, Jon said. I have ravens, Sam said. It's almost the same thing. I want to send letters to the mountain clans. Not from Stannis, not yet. From the Watch. There's work for men who prefer their enemies to the south of them and their friends to the north. There's food. There's a king who will not cut down your trees for ships. He looked up at Jon with a hopeful awkwardness that had not diminished with the years. We could speak their names right. We could ask them for their names. People like to be asked. Write them, Jon said. Send them with men who won't get lost in hills that don't want to be found. Send one with 1-1 if he'll go. The hills will not argue with a giant. They will merely take a better look. Sam's smile was half joy, half terror. I'll ask him, he said, and the image of Sam asking a giant for a favor warmed Jon in a way that no brazier could. At dusk a rider came from Eastwatch with salt in his hair and news that tasted of it. Sails had been sighted far out to sea, long and low and hungry. Cotter Pike had taken men to the watchtowers on their stilts and had put harpoons into hands that had not lately held them, and the harpoons had felt like friends. Iron-born, Stannis asked, and the rider shook his head. Ships without pride, he said. Hard-looking, low. They hunt in a line. They carry no banners. Salt and smoke, Davos muttered. Men who fish for men. Let them fish, Stannis said. They will draw up only giants and fall back with their nets empty and their thumbs broken. Yet he sent men east, black cloaks and red men both, with orders to stand on piers until their boots froze and to count sails in sleep. The storm that followed came up without a horn's warning and shook the camp like a dog shakes water. Tents bowed and snapped. Fires crouched low and learned humility again. In the middle of it all, Dalla's boy did not cry. He slept with a drunk's dignity and made his mother laugh at a time that should not have admitted laughter. Val sat with her back to the pole of the tent and sharpened her knife and then put it away and set her palms on the ground on either side of her thighs and felt the earth move under her, or perhaps only her own resolve. Outside, men dragged ropes to keep roofs from running away into the night. One braced one tent with a palm and made a windbreak of himself for 3 others, not because anyone had asked him but because he had looked at something small and thought, this will blow away if I do not stand here. In the morning the storm had gone without apologizing, as storms do. It left behind men who looked at each other and said little and began immediately to repair what had been demonstrated to need repairing. A boy born of free folk and Southron air took his second breath more seriously than his first. The red woman's brazier burned the same as if it had not just survived the night. Perhaps it had helped to make it. Jon slept little and dreamed less. When he dreamed, he saw the yard filled with men he knew and men he didn't, all of them carrying thin candles that smoked in a draught he could not find the source of, and each candle guttered in its own time. When he woke, he dressed and went to the yard and set a man's hand straight upon a spear, as if that would keep all the candles from their fates. It would not, but it would keep a few. The headaches of love and law continued their slow exchange. A free folk girl stole a string of onions and was caught. She wept and then lifted her chin and told the man whose onions they were that she'd trade him a story for them, and the man laughed and said he'd rather have the onions. And then he took the story and found that it was worth as much as the onions would have been, and more, and he brought her 2 new strings the next day because he could not keep the pride of having been paid so cheaply to himself. A queen's man in blue tried to push a woman away from the fire she had been using and found himself sitting on his arse with a black eye before he could say, "Your Grace." And when he went to complain to Stannis, the king listened and said, "Keep your hands to yourself." And the man went away puzzled to discover his complaint had been misplaced. Bowen Marsh learned not to say wildling when he meant man who is here now. And Janos Slynt learned that there were rooms in the castle where his voice did not carry and he would not be invited. Letters went out and the answers came back in the feet of men. A score of littles came in a ragged line down the King's Road where it ceased to pretend it was kingly, their faces wind-burned and loyal to themselves and then to their own idea of honor. The Nori sent a man with a beard like a pelt and eyes like a kind dog who said they would come when they had finished setting their own houses to rights and not a moment before. The Wool sent a boy with a message written in the bite marks on his knuckles that said, "We come." They came with their own food tied to their saddles and their own suspicions tied to their faces. Stannis looked at them as if they were numbers in a sum he had expected to be smaller and found satisfying. He set places for them where they would not think themselves guests and told them the truth more than they were used to hearing it. They repaid him with the difficult coin of obedience earned and not owed. At night Mance sang less and played more, as if notes could carry meaning farther than words across a camp where men did not yet understand one another's stories. He had a tune he kept returning to, a minor thing that rose like breath in cold and fell like it too. Once he stopped halfway through and looked into the fire and said, "There's a horn buried in the ground somewhere that men will blow when they forget what they promised beneath trees. I can hear it when I sleep. I hope no one finds it." Tormund threw a bone at him and told him to play something that made men want to go to bed with their wives, and Mance laughed and obliged, and the camp remembered to be human for another night. Word of the Boltons' doings came like a toothache that refused to be looked at. Men were flayed. Men were made examples of in the way cruel men make examples, messily and by being themselves. The Karstarks in their little fastnesses watched and wondered if this Bolton were a wind to be bowed to for a season or a winter to be outlived. Stannis took out his anger not upon his men but upon his map, placing pieces with the precise force of a man teaching a board its place. "We will move soon," he said, and the air around him agreed because when he said he would move, the air had learned he usually did. Before they moved, something moved against them that no man had ordered. A cry rose from the West Watch one evening. Not one horn note, but the ragged shout of a handful of men who had seen something their mouths did not immediately know how to name. Jon ran toward it with Ghost bounding ahead, and the men on the steps made way for him because his body had learned to move in this place and theirs had learned to trust it. The thing they had seen was not a dead man. It was an absence. A place in the snow where something had lain without leaving a print as it left. A cold that bit deeper than the cold around it and stayed when the wind should have pushed it away. Ghost stopped and put his snout into the center of the knot mark and raised his head with a low sound that did not belong to wolves alone. The hair on the back of Jon's neck stood and learned the vocabulary for a word he had no taste for. The watchman backed away without shame. Jon backed away too, and no one thought less of him for it. That night the aurora walked across the sky in curtains green and white and pale blue, and men who had never believed in stories found themselves making new ones inside their heads to explain it. The red woman stood with her face upturned as if letting the light baptize her. "Signs," she said softly to no one. "Always signs." She closed her eyes and smiled. "We are not late." Stannis chose his day as carefully as a farmer chooses when to cut hay. He sent Mance and Tormund and their 1,000 to stir the grasses south where the land bent upon itself, to find the soft places and lay hands upon them until they admitted softness. He sent the mountain men along the ridge roads where a goat would have felt at home. He sent a lean column of his best riders with Davos to the White Knife to coax Wyman's generosity into carts that would find their way to forts starving for kindness. He sent letters to holdings that still called themselves Stark. Men, telling them that if they wanted a Stark in Winterfell one day, they might start by not letting a flayed man sit comfortably tonight. He did not send Jon. He did not have to say why. Jon had a wall to keep and a gate to keep and a dozen hearts to keep from turning upon one another like winter-starved dogs. The day they left, the wind blew from the south and smelled faintly of old leaves under snow, like a story that had lost its ending. Jon stood on the steps and looked down at men who had chosen to follow a king who carried his own flint. He thought of how simple it would have been to say yes to Stannis, to take the name that would have put a pelt on his shoulders and a lie in his mouth that might one day have become true. He thought of his father's face carved in stone and of another face made of memory and song. He bowed his head in the direction of both and then turned away and went back up to the wall, to the old blue-white that had no music of its own and yet taught men how to hold tune. There was a letter under a stone on his table when he returned, the paper oiled against weather, the hand spare and competent. He read it and put it down and read it again. The shield hall at Westwatch promised men if food came soon and if a message from the watch, not the crown, told them they were asked for and not requisitioned. "We will not be taken for palmers in our own hall," the hand wrote, prim and proud. He took quill and ink and wrote them the sort of answer men grudgingly consider because it leaves their pride not unbloodied but alive. He added a line in his father's tone by accident and left it there on purpose. "Help us protect the living and we'll call it even." He delivered the letter to Sam by hand. Sam took it gingerly and looked at it as if it might hatch. "I never thought I'd be a man other men waited for letters from," Sam confessed, almost in awe. "I never thought I'd be a man other men called Lord, when they meant the one who answers questions and assigns sufferings," Jon said. "Here we are." Sam smiled. "Here," he agreed. His smile melted into worry as easily as ice melts when set too near the brazier. "Take care, Jon." "I am taking care," Jon said, and then he returned to his care. The next days came like posted sentries, relief following relief. The camp breathed. The wall held. The world did not end. Men died. Always 2, 3, a handful, and not all to the same enemy. A barrel slipped. A horse broke a leg under a rider who had never learned to fall well. A boy took winter into his lungs and could not push it out. Men were buried and men burned, and men did not stop working because of it, because work is what men do when the world insists on living. A courier slipped in from the south with a face like a red map and a mouth full of other men's dust. He brought news stamped with a flayed man's seal and lies weighting the truth like rocks in a river, but the current of it was clear enough. The Boltons had made themselves comfortable and were holding court at Winterfell. Guests had been called to their table. Stark men were expected to sit and smile and swear their swords to a man who wore another man's face. "He will not hold it long," Stannis said when Jon brought him the paper. "But he may hold it long enough." "Long enough for what?" Jon asked. "Men," Stannis said. "Long enough for some to look at him and say, 'He is here and eating and the snow falls just the same. Perhaps he is who he says he is.' Long enough for the ground to learn the shape of his horse's foot. I will teach the ground a different shape." He set his finger down on the name Winterfell on the map and left it there. "This is the work. The rest is what men will sing when they forget why they were afraid." Night returned with its old interruptions. Jon lay in his narrow bed and listened to Ghost shift his feet and grumble once. He thought of the door in the earth from his dream and did not go down it. He thought of the boy named for a prince who had refused a crown and for a maester who had upheld his vows and for a joke made by a man who laughed at death and made it laugh back. He thought of the partnership he had helped make in a glade of white wood and old eyes, and he thought of how easily such partnerships ended when men left trees behind. He slept, and the sleep had jagged edges but did not cut. He woke before dawn and went again to the top of the wall. The world below was one more page of the same book, and yet he read it again and found new sentences. Smoke rose where smoke should. Men moved where men were needed. The trees stood like dark verbs. If men could be as steady as trees, the world would not require walls. Men were not trees. They were men. He put his palm to the old ice again, found it cold as ever and as silent. Somewhere deep within it something spoke in a language that took 1,000 years to make a word. He could not wait for that word. He had one of his own, and it would have to serve. By noon he was back in the yard with Tormund's oldest boy, trying to teach him how to hold a pinched handful of fletching steady while the glue set. The boy's mouth made a bow of concentration. "Don't lick it," Jon said, and the boy looked up, guilty, with glue shining on his lip. Tormund snorted and swore and kissed the boy on the head and swore again to make up for it. "He can't keep his tongue out of trouble," Tormund complained fondly. "He gets that from his mother." "He'll be a good archer," Jon said. "Men who learn to be careful with their tongues learn to be careful with their hands. Men who learn to be careful with their tongues never kissed a good woman," Tormund grumbled. "You need to talk nonsense to become wise." "Then you're the wisest man in the camp," Jon said, and Tormund slapped him on the back so hard he nearly put his teeth into his own tongue. The days ran together. One carried a letter from Eastwatch sealed with wax that had cracked in cold, saying the ships without banners had moved away as if bored, and Cotter Pike suspected them of being smugglers or worse. Ser Davos read the note 3 times and said nothing aloud that could be written down. One carried a message from the Shadow Tower that men there would come if asked, provided the asking did not come from Janos Slint. Jon smiled at that and found a man to carry back a message that did not mention Slint's name. One carried a boy from the Norrie with a sack of winter onions and a grin that was missing 2 teeth and a compliment for the wall built into his exhalation, as if he had practiced on the way how to say it so that it sounded natural. On such a day the horn sounded. One long, one short, one long again, the pattern for men returning in numbers with news they should not carry alone. Jon moved before his mind had catalogued the sound. He was in the yard when the first riders came in, their horses' flanks gray with sweat that had frozen into ridges. Mance swung down and his face was a map with lines newly added. Tormund dismounted and steadied a man who looked as if he had left some parts of himself along the way and had made a note to go back for them if he remembered. Jon took Mance's arm, not in aid so much as to anchor him. "They're coming down out of the Dreadfort's shadow," Mance said. "Not the Boltons, the dead. They have learned, if that's a word you can use for them, the ways men used to live. They move in lines now. They follow a horn like children or like wolves. We set fires to turn them aside, and they walked through the fires until their clothes caught, and still they came. We broke 2 and burned them and broke 2 more, and then we ran because you run when a lesson goes bad." "How many?" Jon asked, simple as asking a man how many breads he had left in his bag. "Enough to break a night if you aren't stubborn," Mance said. "Not enough to break a day if you are. But there'll be enough tomorrow when the day is shorter." He looked up at the wall as if seeing it for the first time. "This will be a good place to teach them to hate stone." Stannis came out with his shadow of a crown and his white-blue gaze. He did not waste his question on men who had worn their answers into the yard on their faces. "We move now," he said. "The dead are a tide. The living cannot be driftwood." He pointed to the map only in his mind, where it must have been clearer. "We go to the bar Rolands. We draw them to us. We teach them fire again, and then we teach them retreat. We do not let them choose their ground. We make them walk where the dead hate to walk." He turned his head to Jon. "Keep the gate. Keep the women and the children and the men I will need later. If I die, burn my body before it cools." "If you die," Jon said, because he had learned the economy of truth. "The work does not." A flicker, something like humor, went across the king's face like a fish under ice. "Then it is the right work," he said. He left within the hour with Mance at his right and Tormund at his left and Davos behind him like a measure of what sense the day would make if asked politely. The mountain men flowed along the edges of the column the way fog moves over a hill that knows fog's ways. Melisandre stood before they went and made a gesture that might have been a blessing and might have been a question and might have been both. The men did not ask which. When the last horse's tail disappeared into the trees, the yard felt as if someone had taken a deep breath and not yet let it out. Jon set men to watches and men to counting and men to sleeping while they could. He went to Dalla's tent and stood outside it a moment listening to the small pantry noises of a newborn. Val slid out and looked at him with interest that did not reach for anything in him. "He's quiet," she said. "Too quiet. I slightly prefer it when he's loud. Then I know he means to live forever." She put her hands on her hips and considered him as if he were a field that might be improved. "You're doing the work of 3 men and the face of 1. You should teach your face to rest." "I'll ask it," Jon said. She laughed, and the laugh took some of the frost out of the air between them. "Ask it again if it refuses. Sometimes faces must be told twice." She glanced at the wall and then back at him, and her expression softened in the very small way that meant more than tears in other women. Keep all of them, safe until the men come back. I'll not forgive you if you fail." "I won't forgive myself," Jon said. She shrugged. "I do not care about that." She went inside again and left him to his vows and the sound of a boy breathing. He went to the top of the wall and watched the line of smoke settle and rise, messages in a language older than ink. He did not see men move through the trees. It was not possible to see men move through those trees when they did not wish to be seen. He saw only the certainty of their having gone and the certainty of their having to return. The certainty was a fragile thing, but it held in his hands for the moment. Toward evening, a flock of ravens came in from the south, their wings cutting the air with noise loud as spoons in a hall, and fell upon the rookery like rain. Sam and Eamon worked among them like 2 men trying to untangle lines on a ship left to kink in the sun. Some birds carried no messages and some carried messages in hands men had already learned to read. One carried a strip of skin with letters cut into it crudely, a thing men looked at and did not touch. Jon ordered it burned without asking for permission and without giving any, and if the man who had tied it to a bird felt his message go into smoke, he was not there to complain of it. Night stretched and turned and brought with it the long exhale of wind across the top of the wall. Jon slept in his clothes and woke with them stuck to his skin and did not mind. He woke to a horn in the dark. One long, one long, one long. The wall threw the sound back at itself and made of it a thing that belonged to the place. Jon was on his feet and moving before his mind had made the conclusion of what that pattern meant. He reached the yard in time to see the first line of torches moving toward them through the trees. Not the ragged lurch of men pursued by dread, but the orderly misery of men who have had a long day and have decided not to die at the end of it. He could smell the answer to his questions before the men had mouths to answer with. Burned hair, spilled fear, iron that had not yet been washed off swords. Stannis came in with his sword black to the hilt and his face grimmer than men like to see on a man they are willing to follow. Davos came with a streak of black on his cheek and a white grin that said nothing of joy and everything of survival. Mance came with a bandage on his arm and blood dried on his sleeve and his harp lashed to his back like a promise he insisted upon keeping even when it seemed foolish. Tormund came with half his beard singed and cursing affectionately everything that had singed it. "What did you teach them?" Jon asked Stannis. "How to die where I tell them to," Stannis said, and let out a long breath that might, if he were another man, have been a laugh. "And how to stop walking when their feet are on fire." He looked toward Melisandre without turning his head. She looked at him directly, and the look was not triumph and not pity but something brotherly and harsh. "The lesson will not keep," he added. "I will have to teach it again. And again after that," Davos said, cheerfully bleak. "And then men will tell their sons that their fathers once set dead men to dancing in the snow, and the sons won't believe it and the grandsons will yawn. That is how you know you have survived." Mance told the tale in the hall later with fewer words than he could have used and more than Stannis would have. "They come like cold water poured slowly," he said. "You think you can stand it, and then you cannot stand it, and then you can again because there is nothing else to do. We set them alight. They keep walking until their knees remember. The mountain men were good, They killed without arguing with their hands. Your blue boys learned to keep their prayers for the end and their blades for the middle. He drank and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand with the ease of a man who had drunk with enemies and friends and found the cup tasted the same. We'll do it again, he said. But not tomorrow. Tomorrow we sleep and teach the boys who were not there how to be when they go next time. Tomorrow, Stannis said, we send to the Manderleys for more salt beef. Men who fight better with full stomachs are not weaker. I will not hear that said again in my hearing. He looked at Jon then, and there was a steadiness in his gaze that had less iron in it than usual. You kept it, he said. I've been keeping it, Jon replied. You will keep it longer, Stannis said, and I will persuade the North that it wants me, not because I am lovable but because I am here and useful. That is how men choose their kings when they are honest. When they are not, they choose what looks like their fathers. Something like a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I do not look like anyone's father. You look like the man who survived, Davos murmured almost to himself. That will do. Men slept that night with their boots near their heads and knives where they could find them without waking. A child named Eamon woke twice and ate and announced in a noise like a reed that he would not die tonight, and then proved himself right by settling like an old man in a comfortable chair. Women slept in a ring with their children inside the ring and their knives just outside. Ghost slept with his head on Jon's boots. The fire in Melisandre's brazier burned down low and would not rise when she looked at it, and she smiled at it as if at a stubborn pupil whose stubbornness she admired and would break later with love. Morning came. Men rose. The frost spoke its light words. Jon stood and watched the line between shadow and sun move across the yard like law across a map, and thought that if a man watched long enough he might see it move over his own face. He picked up a spear that had been set down in the wrong place and put it where it belonged. He took a letter from a boy who had run all the way from Eastwatch and could not speak for lack of breath, and put his hand on the boy's shoulder and felt youth under his fingers like a taut string. He went to Dalla's tent and listened to the small greediness of a baby eating and the smaller sigh of a woman who had been allowed to rest. He went to the top of the wall and put his hand on the ice and listened again for the word the ice was making in its slow, slow language. He thought if he had to say what he heard, hold. So he did. He held the gates. He held the men. He held his temper when Janos Slint's voice walked into a room wearing borrowed courage. He held his tongue when Melisandre looked at him, as if to say that names were bones, and she knew which ones would break and which would not. He held to the truth of his vows, as if they were a rope someone had thrown him in a river he had fallen into willingly. He held to the alliance forged under the weirwood while its leaves were white, and kept it alive when the leaves would fall and show the red branches again. He held, because that was the work that did not sing and did not glitter and did not promise a seat at any table except the one where men in black ate stew and scowled together at their luck and found it good. Later, whether that meant tomorrow or a year or the length of a winter that stretched like a road to a place men did not want to visit, men would tell stories about the day Stannis Baratheon allied with Mance Rayder before the battle that never happened because the battle became a dozen small ones. Some would make of it a grand parley in which kings shook hands beneath sacred boughs and swore oaths that neither would break. Some would make of it a trick played by a red woman who lit a fire big enough to be seen on the other side of a storm. Some would make of it the beginning of a new order in which men above the wall and men below it found they had more enemies in common than friends to spare. Jon suspected that none of those stories would be exactly true or exactly false. Stories are like that. They eat truth and leave bones clean. For now there was work. There was the baby who had been named by an old man who had once refused a crown and would, in time, teach the boy the difference between the sound of men lying and the sound of men sleeping. There was a king whose jaw would not learn to soften and who did not bother to forgive his jaw for it. There was a king without a crown whose harp had strings stout as tendons and a laugh that made the air think of home. There was a man with a smuggler's hands alive to any rope's trick and a faith in simple sense that could not be talked out of him by men with titles. There was a woman with a knife and a patience that did not mean kindness. There was a giant who made of his body a wall when a wall was asked for. There were ravens who would keep secrets until their crop burst. Ghost put his head under Jon's hand and forced it up until it rested on his skull. All right, Jon told him, as if the dire wolf had asked a question and would not be denied an answer. "All right." He looked out across the white world and did not try to name it. He had learned the futility of naming what will change before the ink is dry. He had learned the value of standing where you are told and then moving when the standing is finished. He had learned that a wall is not the opposite of a road but its companion. He held, and in the holding he heard, a long way off but there, the song of men returning, the sound different every time and always the same. He turned toward it with the stillness he had learned from ice and the warmth he had learned from wolves, and he made ready the gate.